We have a lot to talk about today. And honestly, this is going to be a tough debrief. It's one that I wasn't sure I wanted to do because of the nature of it. But let's go ahead and get started. Take a close look at this family because this is what flying is supposed to look like. Flying is supposed to be a fun and amazing experience. Unfortunately, when you make a series of reckless decisions, this is what could happen. And there's absolutely no excuse for this, as you're about to find out. But this isn't going to be the only tragic mishap that we're talking about today. Because as I was doing the research on this story, it led me to another one. And this is an image from that crash that took place about 6 years earlier under very different circumstances, but it was just as tragic. And it's worth talking about because of the connection between the two tragedies. So, all that being said, I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Again, this is a live stream, so if you're watching on the replay, thanks for joining in. And it's obviously not going to be as polished as my normal videos, but I'm going to try to get through this in a seamless manner for you, and kind of very similar to what you've seen in my other videos. Want to start with this first mishap by talking a little bit about the background behind this story. This crash took place on January 2nd, 2017, when a family was taking their annual trip from Scottsdale, Arizona to Telluride, Colorado to go skiing. Now, this is a photo of the family that was taken on a previous flight. Now, Eric, he was the pilot flying the plane. He was 44 years old, and I'm going to talk more about him a little bit later. But you can see he's got his two daughters sitting behind him. They're from his first marriage. He's got Victoria, who is 14 years old. And then her sister is right behind her, who is Skylar, and she's 12. Sitting next to Eric is his 31-year-old wife, Carrie. And once again, this photo wasn't taken during the accident flight, but it was something that was shared on Facebook. And again, this is what flying is supposed to look like. You're supposed to be able to take your family on a fun adventure, if this is what you have your license for. But when you're doing that, obviously when you get your license, that requires you to treat flying, it's a professional hobby. It's not something that you can just, hop in and just go off and do without any thought applied to the process. And especially when you're doing a trip like this. So if you're going from Scottsdale, Arizona up to Telluride, Colorado, you've got to take this stuff seriously. It's not like hopping in a car, like I said, and pulling over on the side of the road when something goes wrong. You've got to plan ahead, and you got to think about these things. Especially, this is January and you're flying over the mountains. You're going to have potential for bad weather. You're going to have potential for icing, snow, all these other things that should be in your thought process, especially when you're taking a family on a trip. Now, in this situation, they were going to Telluride, and I made another video on my channel about a mishap that happened in Telluride. And Telluride in and of itself can be, a very dangerous place. You can see the runway 09 there and the mountains off in the distance. And, you've got basically an airport that's at a 9,000 feet elevation, and then it's surrounded by 14,000 foot mountains. So there's a lot that you really need to consider when you're doing this sort of trip. But according to the investigation, it seems like there was zero planning or effort put into this piece of it. Unfortunately, they never even got that far, for this to be a factor. But I wanted to bring it up because it just kind of highlights when you're flight planning, you've got to think about these things ahead of time. And what happened is about 30 minutes after takeoff out of Scottsdale, Arizona, they crashed into the side of a mountain. And so you can see on the map here, you've got the crash site located, but it was what the investigation discovered after the crash that was probably the most shocking part of the story, and really what made me the angriest as I was reading through all the supporting documents for this. And before we get to that, though, we need to start by talking about the aircraft that they were flying. It's a 1970 Cessna 210 Turbo Centurion, basically. November 272 Echo Fox is the registration. The aircraft had gone 16 hours since the last inspection, so there was nothing really wrong with the aircraft, nothing mechanically that contributed to the crash. Eric had purchased this aircraft in 2011, And then a few years later, he found somebody to be a co-owner on the aircraft in 2014. And that's about 3 years before the crash. We know that the aircraft was equipped with a Garmin 750 GPS that was also equipped with TAWS, which is a terrain awareness warning system that helps the pilot, and provides some of those warnings necessary when you're getting too close to terrain, or terrain's going to be a factor for your flight. Um, you know, and I'm not going to get into all the details of that, but just know that it's a tool that the pilot had available to him on the flight. Now, in order to use that, you've got to keep everything updated, especially the GPS databases. And fortunately, the co-owner of the aircraft, when he was interviewed by the NTSB, he went through all the records saying, okay, well, here's all the times I've updated the GPS databases on a regular basis. I tested the TOS system. Everything was working fine. There shouldn't have been any issues with the aircraft. They also looked at the weight and balance for this, and the weight and balance was not a factor for the flight. So ultimately, what does it boil down to? It boils down to the pilot flying the aircraft. Eric was described by one source as a wealthy real estate lawyer. And the only reason I say that is, I think we see in a lot of these mishaps where individuals that have a certain amount of wealth or money, they go off and they purchase an aircraft, and then just assume that they can kind of treat it like any other possession without necessarily putting the due diligence into the effort required to maintain your license or do the things that 99% of safe pilots are doing out there. And I talk about a lot of these mishaps on the channel. Eric was 44 years old. We know he had a private pilot certificate. We also know he had about 295 hours of total flight time. However, he only had about 14 hours in the previous 6 months. One of the biggest issues, though, was he didn't have an instrument rating, and that's going to be a huge factor when it comes to the crash. But if you think that's bad, just wait, because this stuff, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I can't really make this stuff up as I read through these stories and go over this stuff. According to the co-owner, Eric essentially would use this aircraft just for cross-country flying, and he would do about 5 cross-country flights a year. The co-owner described Eric as a risk taker. And so if we kind of do the math on this, we look at it. He bought the aircraft at the end of 2011. The crash was in January 2017. So with about 300 hours of flight time, he was essentially flying the aircraft about 60 hours a year, which really isn't a whole lot. And when he would do these trips, these cross-country flights to take his family on vacation, according to the co-owner, what would happen is Eric would show up at the airport on the day of the flight, or either on the day of the flight or on the day prior, he would show up and do a quick local flight to regain his currency. So if for those of you not familiar, basically there's a requirement that he has to do 3 takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days in order to carry passengers. And in my opinion, obviously that's not something that's going to allow you to maintain a level of proficiency in an aircraft. If you go, 4 or 5 months without flying it, hey, I'm going to hop in real quick. I'm going to knock out 3 takeoff and landings. And then, hey, mom, kids, jump on in and we're going to go on a flight up to Telluride and figure this out on the way. And I think that's the issue that I have when it comes to pilots not treating their licenses the way they should, with the level of responsibility required. When they looked at his logbook, what they discovered was the last flight in his logbook was dated August 28th. And remember, this crash happened in January. However, there's no year on this, so they weren't even sure if this is from the most recent year. Even if it was, that's over 4 months prior to when this crash happened. You'll note that it also says, he put in the remarks here, that it was a flight review and he logged 3 takeoff and landings. However, when you go to the back of his flight book for the endorsement sections, there's no flight reviews that were signed off on August 28th. There's one from August 27th of 2014, like 3 years prior. And then he also had one signed off here at the bottom in May of 2016. And what's interesting to me too is there's no flight logged in his logbook showing that flight review on May 11th of 2016. And honestly, like I haven't filled out one of these logbooks since 20 years ago when I did my private pilot license, because all of my flights were logged by the military. So that wasn't something that I had to worry too much about keeping up with. But when you look at this logbook, you can see that all of I thought the CFIs filled these out, and they're supposed to check your logbook when they do this. So let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that. But when I look at this, I see all of the handwriting looks the exact same. So I don't know if he was logging these flight reviews himself or what the deal was. Obviously, there's a CFI number that's listed on there that the NTSB has redacted, so we can't see what that is. Unfortunately, when you go into the records of the investigation, the NTSB didn't provide any details on who these flight instructors were. They didn't, list their numbers. They didn't try to interview them to find out more details about, the history of the pilot and, what might have contributed to the actions that he took on the day of the crash. But it's something that it's a little frustrating because I think that it would have helped out in this situation. Either way, he's got a questionable history in terms of his flight records, in terms of logging his actual flights, and whether he was, he definitely, I don't want to say definitely, but more than likely, all the evidence points to he was not current or recent in the aircraft when he went to conduct this flight with his family. And that brings us to talking about the weather. And I have talked about weather multiple times in other videos on this channel. And this is one I still can't wrap my head around it. When you're a pilot, it's just common sense. When you're going to do a flight, you look outside at least and see what the weather's doing, right? And if it's a clear day and you're just flying around the pattern, great, but when you're planning a cross-country flight, several hundred miles over the mountains in the middle of the winter, weather is going to be something that you need to pay attention to. And there's a ton of resources that you have available in order to do that. Now, the weather at Scottsdale and Telluride was VFR at both places. The problem was the weather everywhere in between. On the day of the crash, there were some air mets that were issued. Those are Airman's Meteorological Information. And so there are basically advisories warning you about conditions that aren't favorable for flying or that you might want to be aware of. In this case, there was an air met. Sierra and Tango were issued. And one of them talking about IFR conditions and mountain obscuration conditions due to clouds. And you can see both of those right here. Now, this is something that I don't expect people to be able to interpret or understand. And that's fine because they have a graphical depiction of all this. You can go to the website, aviationweather.gov/GFA, and it'll show you what all of these are and the graphical depiction. You can move your mouse over them and click and get all the details to find out what's going on. And then, just figure out, hey, is this going to impact my route? However, I think a better source, if you want to use one, is just call 1-800-WX-BRIEF or go to 1-800-WXBRIEF.com. And you can fill all this stuff out. And they even have this little link to an instructional video that shows you how to do it if you don't understand that. And that's going to tell you everything that you need to know in order to safely plan for the flight that you're going to do. This is the image taken or provided by the NTSB meteorologist after the accident. Kapan is the closest airfield. You can see there, and then the accident site is just about 10 miles to the north of it. And this is the cloud cover in the area. Now, when Eric took off, we know that he never talked to air traffic control. And he made no attempt to climb above the weather. The weather at Payson Field, which was just a few miles south of the crash, was overcast at 300 feet. There's your crash site. The cloud tops were at 11,000 feet. So it's possible he maybe could have climbed above them. I don't know. But he never made any attempt to. He didn't talk to the controller about the weather, didn't ask any questions, didn't try to turn around. So he continued straight ahead. Now, what's interesting with this is, and this is why I really like doing these deep dives in the NTSB docket, because you find out so much information about the human factors and other things in the investigation that aren't necessarily included in the final report. And what I have on this picture here is a route of flight that another aircraft was taking that was in the area. And so you can see this guy, he was taken off from, it was a Cessna 182, and he was taken off from Henderson in Las Vegas, and he was heading down to Arizona. And according to that pilot, as he's doing this flight, he said the weather deteriorated sharply with the ceiling below 12,000. I cleared through air traffic control, or I requested through air traffic control for flight following and descended to 9,500 feet due to the lower ceiling. But the weather and the clouds quickly dropped below minimums, and I was surrounded by clouds and no horizon. Now, keep in mind that this guy's putting all of this in his official statement with the NTSB, and that's why I like some of these things with the NTSB is because they want to focus on safety. So it's not about trying to punish people for giving statements, maybe screwing something up. And here's this guy admitting, he took off on a VFR flight and he found himself in a bad situation in the same area that this crash happened. That's the crash site. From the crash that we're talking about. This guy ends up turning around somewhere about halfway, or maybe about 2/3 of the way through the flight. And I want you to look at this right here because this was actually from his statement. He says, I'm writing this to note a few things. The weather was worse than it appeared, or worse than it was forecast, basically. And in addition, it was hard to believe that IMC could develop so quickly from what happened to be stable air. The winds were fast, and the VFR, and basically had a strong tailwind, and VFR conditions changed so quickly. Definitely it was a challenge. I learned quite a lesson that day. I think that was really worth sharing because we see a number of instances of pilots that are VFR only pilots, which is perfectly fine because 99% of VFR only pilots are safe. They're doing the right thing. But we see these incidents where VFR pilots are flying into the weather. And I think sometimes, as you can tell from that guy's statement, he didn't expect that to happen, but he got himself in a bad situation and he made the right decision. He's talking to air traffic control, says, hey, this is what I need to do. And I'm going to turn around. And he ended up turning around and diverted somewhere else and then finished the flight the next day because the weather had cleared up the next day. And so it was perfectly fine. What we've seen when we look at the accident investigation statistics is that when it comes to weather-related tragedies, it's roughly, I think, about half of those are VFR into IMC conditions. And of those that are VFR into IMC conditions, it's somewhere between 80 to 90% end up being fatal. And my thoughts on that are, I can see how it's possible you could find yourself in that situation. What I would recommend, if you're a pilot and you don't have a lot of experience, or whether you do or not, and you find yourself VFR into an IMC situation, first thing you want to do is, if it's coming up on you and you can avoid it, go ahead and turn around while you still can, and don't even go in the weather and do the flight another day. But if you find yourself in the weather, you've got to make a decision. How am I going to get out of it? And if you have an autopilot on your aircraft, which this aircraft in this crash actually did have an autopilot. So if you have an autopilot and you know how to use it, which you should, use it to your advantage to have the aircraft turn back around and exit the weather while at the same time communicating to air traffic control, declaring an emergency. And don't be afraid to tell them, hey, I'm a VFR only pilot and I've just gone in the weather. I'm doing an emergency turn to get out of the weather. And even if you don't have an autopilot, you can request for a heading to get you back pointed in a direction that might be more favorable, if you're doing a 180. And the only reason I say that is because once you start that turn and you're in the weather, you lose all visual references, right? So if you can't see outside, how do you know which way to go to get out of the weather? And it can be very disorienting. So you want to use air traffic control to help you with that. The other thing you want to do is make those turns in a shallow angle of bank at a slow rate, because I think the tendency for some pilots is, let me try to turn around as fast as possible to get out of this weather. And that can be extremely disorienting if you're trying to do, a high bank turn to get turned back around. So I'll just leave it at that. But there's definitely a ton of websites and ton of videos that you can find online that are going to help you, understand this threat and understand what to do when you get in that situation. And I'm sure some of you that are watching this video have experienced that. And if you care to, share your experience in the comments and let people know what you did in that sort of situation, so that way others can learn. That brings us basically to the crash. This is a image that was provided by the NTSB showing the route of flight of the aircraft and the weather that was happening at the time of the crash. According to the NTSB, there was no record of the pilot getting a weather briefing from flight service. There was no record of him checking weather on ForeFlight, calling anybody for weather, or asking anybody for weather. No one saw him using the computers at the FBO to check weather. So they did say it's possible he could have used another source that we're not aware of, but I don't think that's the case. And then to top it all off, he didn't file a flight plan. You're going to take off in the middle of winter on a VFR only flight plan with VFR only flight without filing a flight plan is just ridiculous, especially given the weather considerations. And trust me, this isn't even the tip of the iceberg yet. This image was provided by the NTSB, and you can see exactly what happened. The black line represents his route of flight, showing you how he's initially climbing up and he's in VMC conditions. Then he gets into some sort of combination of VMC and IMC. So that's that opportunity. Like I was saying, maybe he thought he could climb above the weather or whatnot, and he decided not to. Even though if he kept his climb going, he would have been above the weather and he probably would have been fine. But that was a perfect opportunity to turn around. And he had the chance to, and he just didn't. And instead, he decided to essentially scud run it, is the term that a lot of people are familiar with, where you're basically just trying to get as low to the ground as possible and hope to stay under the weather the entire time. Well, what happens is he gets himself in full IMC conditions where he doesn't have any ground references. And then he starts flying the aircraft lower and lower until he essentially runs out of options. Although the autopilot switch was found in the on position at the accident site, they could tell, and you can see here from the chart, from his changes in altitude stuff, he most likely wasn't using the autopilot at all during the flight. And then this last little climb here at the very end, they're not sure if the terrain awareness warning system gave him a heads up that there was terrain ahead, but what they saw was in the last few seconds of the flight, it was a rapid 500-foot climb, suggesting either he saw the ridge line coming ahead, or that TAWS was going off. And then that's kind of what warned him. And he tried to do the climb, but unfortunately wasn't able to get out of the way in time. All of this brings us to the interview, which was probably the most shocking piece of this story. Forget the fact that the guy didn't file a flight plan and didn't do any sort of weather research for the flight itself. And just one more comment on this. If you're doing this stuff, like, I don't understand, if you can afford to pay this much money for an aircraft and afford to take your family on vacations to Telluride, Colorado to go skiing, like, you can afford to get an instrument rating. You can afford to have somebody fly with you if you don't know what you're doing. And so there's just no excuse for this sort of stuff. According to the interview, 2 days before the accident, Eric had asked the co-owner to research the weather forecast and cross-check it against his flight plan. Even though he didn't have a flight plan, he kind of told the guy, here's where I want to go. And when the co-owner reviewed the flight plan and researched the weather, he told Eric, hey, Sunday and Monday, the day before and the day that you want to fly, these are not good options because the weather is going to be really bad. I would not do it, and I highly recommend you drive to Telluride. Keep in mind that the co-owner, he is a instrument rated pilot, and he also told the NTSB that this is not a flight that he would have done given the weather conditions. So regardless of what he said, though, Eric went to the airport. He's taken his new wife and his 2 kids without any thought for their safety, in my mind. Is the way I view this. He throws them in the plane and then he takes off and does this stuff. Remember, though, that Eric was divorced. According to one of the news articles that I found, when they looked at the child care agreement section of the divorce, there was a requirement that if the girls were flying on a private plane, the pilot had to have a commercial license and file a flight plan. Obviously, Eric did not have a commercial license. He did not file a flight plan. And now his kids are dead. He's dead. His new wife is dead. And reading the story of the mother is what got me to the next story that we're going to take a look at, because this mother lost, her children in this flight. And that's exactly what happened in this other story. This was another tragedy involving a mother who lost her 3 children and her former husband in a plane crash that happened just to the east of Phoenix. So essentially in that same area. And the big thing with this one was weather was not a factor in this tragedy. But before we take a look at that, I just want to take a break for a second. I have to get a drink here. And I also want to say, for those of you that have been with the channel for a long time, thank you so much for your support. I've mentioned this on other live streams and stuff, but the comments and the emails that I get from people that watch these videos are amazing. And the days when it's tough to do these debriefs, it's really inspiring to hear some of your personal stories and get those messages, because it kind of helps me, okay, like I need to do this because it is making a difference out there. And the people that are watching these videos, they're the ones that are being safe, and they're using these lessons to, become better pilots and make smart decisions. If you want to support the channel, I do want to make a couple of quick announcements, if you guys don't mind. So bear with me while I try to manage my live stream here. And this is, kind of the beauty of doing the live stream. You got to try to figure this stuff out. Actually, I don't think I have it, but basically, if you guys want to support the channel, highly recommend you go over to the website, pilotdebrief.com. You can find all sorts of gear on the channel that you can take a look at. I've also got, if you guys saw me out at Oshkosh, I had some cool sunglasses on that I was wearing. Flying Eyes Optics is they're not a sponsor. They didn't sponsor this video, but I do like their glasses because they fit really well underneath my headset when I'm flying without giving me like hot spots and stuff. If you guys want 10% off, I've put a link in the video description below. You guys can go either click on that link or use the code Hoover and you get 10% off those as well. And then in the pinned comment for this video, we've got our Discord community. So if you want to be a part of the discussion or ask questions and engage with other pilots and stuff, highly recommend you go to the Discord community. It's completely free and you guys can chat over there. And I pop in there from time to time as well. Especially we share all the preliminary reports and the final reports from the NTSB for the accidents in there. And that's where I find a lot of these stories to talk about. And so I appreciate everyone's support on all of that. All right. Now, when it comes to this story here, getting back into it. This story began on 23 November of 2011. You've got 3 adults and 3 kids, and they boarded a plane at Falcon Field, Arizona, and they're going to fly down to Safford. Now, unlike the last story, in this one, the weather was completely clear skies. You've got 2 pilots on board the plane, but they still end up crashing into the side of a mountain just a few minutes after takeoff. You can see the crash site is right there. The crash site from the previous mishap that we just talked about is just a few miles to the north of that. And this story, what you had essentially was a company that was known, the company was Ponderosa Aviation. They're providing contract services for the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. So they had a small fleet of aircraft. As they're trying to grow their business, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But as they're trying to grow their business, they decided to purchase a Rockwell Commander up in Indiana. And this is what that aircraft looked like. And this was a picture that was taken from the actual sale advertisement of the aircraft. It's a 1976 Rockwell Commander. The aircraft was advertised as having TAWS, and I talked about that earlier, but that's that terrain awareness warning system. And the FAA made a note in the investigation with the NTSB that when it comes to this aircraft, there was a requirement because there was the original aircraft configuration has seats for 6 passengers. And so TAWS was required as of March of 2005 for that to be installed on the aircraft. And the original owner of the aircraft said, well, I don't know. I don't really want to install this. So how can I make some changes to modify my aircraft so I don't have to install TAWS? So he sent off a request to the FAA where he said, what I want to do is I want to take the rear seat that seats 3 and I want to change the buckles in it and do this and make it seat only 2. The FAA responded here in March 29th, 2005, saying that the seating plan that the aircraft left the factory with is the only approved seating plan for this aircraft. Any other seating plan, you've got to get that an approval by us, essentially. Or the FAA needs to come out and do a visit, and sign off on that. That was in March of 2005. A few months later, they made the modifications anyway without approval. And what they did, you can see, this is the picture from the far aft seats in the cabin there. It was a bench style seating, and they just took out the center seat belt, was what it boiled down to. And so now instead of seating 3 back there, it's seating 2. And that was their way of getting around the requirement to install TAWS on the aircraft. So TAWS was never installed. And even though this isn't really what caused the crash, I think it's important to bring up because this is just, once again, how all the holes in the Swiss cheese line up. All these little things start to build into this picture. In addition, when the company went to buy this aircraft, they learned that it was overdue for a 150-hour inspection. And so they coordinated to get a ferry permit to conduct 1 flight only to fly the aircraft from Indiana back to Arizona. And they did that flight on the 17th of November, 6 days before the crash. And this is where it's important to understand who was on board the plane. You've got Russell, who is a pilot. He is a director of maintenance for Ponderosa Aviation. Then you have Sean, who's also a pilot. He was the director of operations for the company. And then the other adult was Joe, who was a passenger. He worked for Ponderosa. He didn't have a pilot certificate, and he was just along for the ride. He heard about the flight. He's like, hey, let me grab a headset. I'm going to go with you guys. The first flight they did, and again, I think this speaks to possibly the culture of the organization and some of the other issues that played into this tragedy, because even though this aircraft wasn't airworthy, they hadn't done the inspection. Remember, it just came back on a ferry flight. They decided to take the aircraft and fly anyway. So you've got a director of operations and a director of maintenance without any discussion about the airworthiness of the aircraft, deciding to take it on a flight to go pick up. It was Russell and Sean, and they were going to pick up Sean's kids to take him back to Safford, Arizona, without any thought about this. And ultimately, it was nothing wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the crash. But if you have the leadership of a company saying, hey, it's perfectly acceptable for us to take an aircraft that's not worthy, then what do you think the rest of the pilots in your organization are gonna do? Are they going to be willing to abide by the rules if you're not? So I think that's a huge factor that's worth pointing out. The first flight was relatively uneventful. They ended up landing at Falcon Field, Arizona. Sean gets out. He picks up his 3 kids. And Sean did the flight from Arizona to Falcon Field. And then they swapped seats, and Russell ends up flying the aircraft back out of Falcon Field. When they got in that plane, Sean and his 3 kids, I don't think they had any idea the danger that they were in and what was going to happen, because, to them, it was just an issue of complacency. Everything, we're just doing things the way we always do them, and we're not really thinking about some of these things. When we take a look at Russell, he was 31 years old. He had a commercial pilot license. He had over 1,100 hours of single engine time, and he had over 950 hours of multi engine time. So this guy had a lot of experience flying aircraft and should have known better for what he ended up doing. Sean, he was described, the FAA and the NTSB said he was a pilot. I could not find the records on that. The NTSB docket didn't provide any information, and mainly because he wasn't the pilot flying the aircraft for the return flight. So they didn't really talk about this, but he was 39 years old. We don't know what type of pilot license he had, but according to witness interviews and other documents within the investigation, he was described as one of the best pilots that people had flown with, and it was highly experienced. However, he had let he didn't have his medical certificate because he had forfeited it earlier in the year. And so what he would do is he would always get Russell or one of the other pilots to fly with him on these flights. And he would go pick up his children every other weekend. And so this was just another routine trip. So we don't know how many hours or experience he had. And I think this is something that it would have been useful to the investigation, because when you look at the NTSB docket, there was, I think, like 40 or 50 different attachments of interviews and resources and things like that the NTSB looked at. But, it's like, okay, well, look at the other guy that had a license and was qualified to fly, because, that plays into some of this as well. The biggest issue when it comes to the weather, even though it was VFR, they're taking off out of Falcon Field. It's at night, it's clear skies, but there's no moon. So basically, pitch black type of scenario, if you will. Now, when you depart out of Falcon Field, the issue that they have to think about is this Class Bravo airspace. And you can see that right here depicted by these blue rings. Falcon Field sits underneath the Class Bravo airspace. Worst case, or out here in this area goes down to the Class Bravo goes down to 5,000 feet. So there's a couple ways to depart out of here. And one of those ways is you can climb up into the Class Bravo if you're on a VFR flight plan, but you got to request a clearance. You could file an IFR flight plan, which is very easy for somebody with a commercial pilot license to do. Like, they should know how to do that and file an IFR flight plan, and that way you don't have to worry about it. My gut tells me that most of the companies flying was probably VFR, because they were providing these forestry services to the U.S. government. And so they probably didn't really have, set routes and things like that they were doing. And when you get used to doing so much VFR flying, you just don't, I think they just kind of stop bothering with trying to do IFR flight plans and filing IFR. So if you're going to take off VFR, you can stay under the Class Bravo, but you got to be aware of all the terrain that's out here. And there's other ways that you can avoid it, and we'll talk about that in a second. One of the things that was brought up in the course of this investigation was that there was a lot of complaints that, hey, well, all these VFR pilots out here, they can't get clearance to enter the Class Bravo airspace. They're talking to air traffic control, and that's just not possible. Well, the truth is they went back and they did a study, and they found that of 600, and it was like over a couple month period, but of 619 requests for VFR aircraft to enter the Class Bravo airspace, 598 were granted permission. So almost 97% of VFR aircraft requesting to enter the airspace were permitted to do so. So there really wasn't an excuse, and I'm not sure why you wouldn't even make an attempt to do that. So he takes off. Again, kind of like Eric, he's taking off VFR. He's taking off at night. He doesn't have a flight plan, and he's not talking to air traffic control. The big difference that happened on this issue, and I'll go back to this picture. You can see this picture right here. This purple line shows a direct route from Falcon Field back to Safford, Arizona. What they discovered was the pilot had a history of his normal method of navigation. As soon as he get airborne, he would figure out what VFR direct would look like, and then he would turn and fly that heading. And he normally had an iPad that he flew with that had a moving map capability. And they found that in the wreckage, but they couldn't determine whether he was using it, or if he was using it, what kind of display he might have had on that. So that kind of factored into this. And then you also look at this and you go, I think it was 3 nights prior, maybe 4 nights prior, he had done the exact same flight. And that's Russell flew this exact same route, roughly around the same time. So hey, this is just a normal flight. I've done this hundreds of times probably. It's going to be the same as every other time. I'm going to take off, I'm going to turn, I'm going to go VFR direct. The biggest thing that made a difference on this flight, though, was when he took off, Tower asked him to fly runway heading and delay your turn because of an inbound aircraft. And Tower is going to call his turn to the right. You can see when he does that and makes that right-hand turn, that route of flight, essentially, if he goes VFR direct at that point, puts him flying right through the middle of the mountain, which is exactly what happened. At no point did he ever request VFR flight following. Did he ever talk to air traffic control and ask for a min safe altitude warning or anything else? It's just an issue of complacency. Was way too complacent. And I don't, it's hard to imagine to me, because when you look at this terrain, I don't know what you're thinking when you decide to take off at night, flying low altitude, when you're surrounded by mountains, without doing any sort of like flight planning, without thinking about, hey, maybe I should talk to somebody, make sure I don't run into this stuff. Or, hey, what's my min safe altitude for flying out here? Let's at least get above the min safe altitude, or let's get into the Class Bravo airspace. He didn't do any of that. He just kind of took off and went. And that's what they determined is, on a moonless night, without any sort of outside visual references, they just never saw these. There's no lights on these mountains, to warn them that they're there. And they never saw them. They flew straight into the side of it without making any sort of attempt to avoid it. So I know that one wasn't as detailed as what I would have liked for it to be, but I just got back from a 3-day trip, and I'm still trying to get caught up on everything. And I wanted to get this live stream out, and I appreciate you guys sticking around. One of the main benefits of me doing a live stream, I think, is it allows me to cover more mishaps, and I'm going to start covering some more of the recent mishaps that you guys are seeing in the news, and the live stream format allows me to do that and kind of engage with you guys throughout that process. Because honestly, the amount of work that goes into building some of these videos and the research involved tends to be quite a bit, especially for the longer videos. And the only reason I bring all this up is because, unfortunately, I will not have a video on the channel tomorrow. I think it's like the second time in the past year and a half that I wasn't able to upload a video. But I just got too behind. We're wrapping up the summer. The kids are still out of school. And so we're trying to wrap some things up here. But I appreciate you guys hanging around for the debrief today. And hopefully you guys are enjoying the live stream format. And if you didn't watch this live, hopefully the replay is just as good. And looking forward to engaging with your comments. If you guys have questions, I'm going to ask Sticks is in the background. Sticks, was there anything that we didn't get to from most of the questions today?
Yeah, actually, there were a few questions. First off, I've also add in, I'll introduce myself real quick. My name is John Hall. I was a Coast Guard helicopter pilot and actually helped co-produce a podcast called So There I Was. So one of the questions, first off, we got some amazing comments, and also we've got people coming from all over the UK, South Africa, the Netherlands, Germany. So it was amazing to see some of the people that were on here. So one of the questions we got was, what is the difference between IMC and IFR? And VFR and VMC. I don't think we've actually covered that, but we could probably briefly discuss that.
Yeah. So essentially, IMC, instrument meteorological conditions, and VMC, visual meteorological conditions, is basically just a description of the actual weather itself. And so that's going to be I forget what the actual numbers are. And when you go on like ForeFlight and stuff, things are color coded that allows you to see like airports, whether they're, VMC, IMC, VFR, IFR. They're used interchangeably, I would say. But the big thing you want to keep in mind is if you are a VFR only pilot, that means you do not have an instrument rating. That means you cannot fly in the weather. You have to maintain certain cloud clearances, a certain distance away from the clouds, and be clear of the clouds during your flight, depending on what type of airspace that you're flying in. And you need to avoid the weather. Now, if you have an instrument rating, you can file an IFR flight plan, which is an instrument flight plan or an instrument flight rating. So you can file an IFR flight plan. That's going to allow you to do a couple things. You can go into Class A airspace, which is above 18,000 feet. You can fly into the weather. You can shoot instrument approaches, assuming you're qualified, on that aircraft type and actually have the recency of experience to do that, because we have seen that in mishaps before. But those are the big things that, VFR and IFR and kind of the big differences there.
Right. And I would also add, interestingly, if you go and look there's a resource called the Pilot Information Handbook, and also the Airman Information Manual, or AIM. And you can find some of these terms are defined there. Somebody had asked a question about like where you were getting your chart images from. One of the things that I would potentially recommend, and I'm not sure if you use this one or not, but skyvector.com
that's exactly what I use for a lot of these. Is I go to Skyvector and I can pull the stuff there and just has a lot of information. Also has all the information you need on all the airports and links to airfield diagrams, instrument approaches, and all that stuff. Because that's the other thing. Like if you're not going to fly with an iPad or some other type of electronic flight book device, and you're going to fly instrument approaches, at least have a hard copy printout of the approach, so you know what you're doing when you go to fly it. So we don't end up like some of these people that I've seen, in these audio transcripts where, hey, my iPad died and I can't fly the approach now. Well, dude, like take a paper copy with you, so.
Right. And somebody had asked what helicopter I flew in the Coast Guard. The one that's behind me, H-65 Dolphin, aka Tupper Wolf, is what we called that. Let's see. I also turned the volume up on my mic. Somebody had asked that question. Trying to think if there was a couple of other questions, but I'm trying to. So I had tried to remind people to actually, if you're going to ask a question, preface it with three question marks in front, so I know to look for it.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say, when I look at these things, what's really fascinating, it's fascinating to me to get into the human factors side of these mishaps, which the NTSB doesn't necessarily get into as much as I think they could, because there's a lot of benefit to the human factors side of the equation. That's when we start to figure out, okay, well, why is it that this person made this decision? Because when we look at that first mishap and we go back and I look at that and I go, well, how in the world does, a pilot who has very limited experience in the aircraft, doesn't necessarily know what he's doing, decide to go ahead and throw his family on board? Let me see. I was going to pull up the picture here. But puts his family in this aircraft without really, even when he's warned, like, dude, the weather's going to be bad. Don't do the flight. You should drive. And instead he's like, oh no, like it's, he doesn't even like try to argue with the guy. He just doesn't say anything. He just, well, I'm just going to do it anyways. And not only am I going to do it anyways, but like, I'm not going to actually look at the weather when I go fly.
Right. And what I find, there's always this, it's that human factors piece. And when you get up in the morning and you're going to go fly, you're not saying to yourself, oh, well, I'm going to crash this plane. And nobody gets up with the intent to do that. And, my professional job now is I work in healthcare, and we see similar deals. Healthcare providers don't make medical errors, or we don't intend to make medical errors, but yet we do. And so I think a lot of the what we have learned in aviation and aviation safety with human factors, um, it's, I think all of that can be applied in towards healthcare as well. And before I started flying for the Coast Guard, I actually did marine casualty investigations. And so we actually sort of, learned human factors and root cause analysis and all of that process. So, I find the whole discussion interesting, and often it's one decision is that link of errors. One thing leads to the next and the next. Somebody asked me what I do in healthcare. I work as a nurse practitioner. So on the side, I've been a paramedic and so I've an EMT paramedic, and then went into the Coast Guard after graduating from the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So it's a long sorted history that I have, and sounds like it's bad, poorly controlled ADD. So
yeah, well, one of the things that I didn't, to your point about, the chain of events and stuff like that, I think on the human factors side of things, I haven't talked about this in any of my videos, so I'm gonna do a little bit deeper discussion in one of my videos coming up. But it's something called I think it's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm talking about, Sticks. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of you that aren't familiar with and I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but with the Dunning-Kruger effect, essentially think of it like, I use driving a car as a comparison, right? Because I've got a 15-year-old that's learning how to drive right now. So
right.
When you're, my age, or, once you get past a certain age, driving becomes kind of second nature, and you don't really think much of it. And what the Dunning-Kruger effect says is, like, we kind of live on this curve, right? And if you're a teenager and you're just starting to drive, you have a lot of overconfidence in some of the things that you do, because there's so much that you don't know about the danger of a situation that
Right.
you get yourself into. Whereas somebody on the opposite end of that, like me, we tend to also overestimate how easy it is to do something,
Right.
So I, if I'm driving with my teenager, I'm like, well, how could you not know to look for that car that was coming, during that turn, or whatever the case is? And it's because I have so much experience that I'm overestimating how difficult it is for her.
Right.
And then on her side of it, she's underestimating, she's overestimating her own ability, but underestimating the danger of the situation. And it's kind of the same thing for pilots. When I think that's where we see it a lot with, especially on the individuals that have the money that can afford to buy a plane. I'm going to buy like a Cirrus or something because that keeps me safe. That's a safe airplane to fly. And now I don't have to worry as much about my skills because the airplane is going to keep me safe. And they don't have enough time and experience in aviation to understand, when they're first starting off, all the things that could kill them. And
Right.
they're just like in Eric's situation, like you said, he didn't walk out the door saying, I'm going to go kill my family today, but that's exactly what his plan was. He just didn't
Right.
realize it.
He had what I would refer to as a failure of imagination. And,
Yeah.
And if we fail to sometimes really think or troubleshoot and think about these things, then it's very easy to sort of continue with operations into a very dangerous situation. And I think one thing that is often overlooked, or one thing that I was taught when I was in flying for the Coast Guard, one of my operations officers said, the hardest maneuver, he asked me, what's the hardest maneuver to do in a helicopter, and a rescue helicopter? And I was like, I don't know. And he actually said it's the 180-degree turn. It's to make that decision to turn back around and say, you know what, this condition is too much. These conditions are too much, and we may not come back. And, especially when you may be that person that's trying to save somebody else's life. It is a difficult decision. And I think there's a lot of crossover with this when it comes to young people and learning how to drive. So young kids are learning how to drive. There is no substitute for time behind the wheel. In a lot of states, they only require 40 hours, but I think that's a lot less than what it should be. And you need to, like, one of the things I've advocated for and I've done it with my kids, every 30 days, I'm going to go drive with them after they've gotten their license so that I can keep tabs on how they're doing and help prevent them from developing negative habits. And so I think there's some interesting cross correlation there. But one other question that I did see in there was, shouldn't all pilots ultimately get their instrument rating?
I knew that we should have brought that up. I knew that was going to come up, and because I get that comment a lot on my videos, like, well, why doesn't everybody have an instrument rating? Why isn't that mandatory? It's because it's not needed. Like, if you're going to be a VFR pilot, like that, like is doing the safe and responsible thing, and you're just flying for fun, and you're just going to, actually follow the rules and fly VFR, then do that, and that's, like I said, 99% of pilots that are VFR only, they don't have any issues doing that. It's the guys that go, well, I'm going to get a pilot license and I'm a VFR pilot, but I don't care. I can make this work, or I don't plan for the weather, or I don't think about weather could be a factor. And now I get myself in a dangerous situation. But to me, there's no excuse. Like, in my opinion, if you're a VFR only pilot and you've got an aircraft, I think, the Turbo Centurion's only a couple $100,000, but like still, if you can pay a couple $100,000 for an aircraft, you can pay a little bit more to get your instrument rating. And then that way you can, fly safely in the weather, especially if you're going to plan to use your aircraft repeatedly to do cross country flights from Arizona to Telluride, over the mountains in the middle of the winter. Like, get a freaking instrument rating and file an IFR flight plan and stay safe. Like, there's no reason not to. Like, it's not that difficult. And I think in his situation too, like, I didn't talk too much about it, but this was like a recurring thing. Like, he would always take the family to Telluride, maybe, twice a year or something like that. So my guess is he's probably had to deal with the weather before, and he's just gotten away with it.
Right.
He was,
and exactly. And
so
I had
complacency of it.
I've scud run before, but there's a big difference in, when you're in a helicopter with another instrument rated pilot and you have, an instrument capable aircraft, you can sometimes push those barriers, but then that can sort of start to make you complacent and comfortable. And then you forget that, okay, if I'm going to go hop into a civilian aircraft now, that's a very different deal, especially if you're by yourself. And, it's not something that you want to it's not a situation you want to get yourself into. And again, sometimes that the more important decision to make is the one that says, we're not going to fly today.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Clark, thanks for the super chat there. I appreciate that. You're 100% right, but again, like, as I said earlier, it's fascinating to me to kind of dig into the human factors things and like try to figure out what's going through people's minds, because ultimately, like, if we can start to identify some of those issues, then that's how we can use that information to educate others and prevent future mishaps. Because, hey, we've seen this thing over and over again, and here's why it happened, and here's what you can do to potentially avoid that. So,
no, I agree. I appreciate everything that you're doing here, which is why I come by to help when I can. And I think the general feedback in a lot of these comments has been awesome in that, I think it's also appreciated your professionalism, your insight. And I think the other thing that is definitely appreciated is you're human about it. And, you have that connection, and there's this, you can tell that this is, something that you're passionate about. For you, it's a bit of I would say it's a vocation. It's some sort of a calling for you. I think it's great. So,
thanks. Hey, coming up, for those of you that are still in the live stream, coming up in the future, I'm going to talk about the Nealon family plane crash that happened in Wyoming in July, because I've got a lot of email requests to cover that. And I've the preliminary NTSB report still isn't out on that one, but from what I've discovered from looking at some of the flight data, and I put this into a website, it's called flysto.net, FLYSTO, flysto.net. It's a free service that, anyone can use. I highly recommend pilots check it out. And again, they're not a sponsor or anything, but I use it to do all these debriefs, and I put that Nealon family crash into there, basically taking the ADSB flight data to analyze it. And there's something that I discovered looking at that related to another PC-12 plane crash that had happened a few years back. It was absolutely horrific, but the two of them were almost the exact same circumstances. When you look at the ADSB data, it's almost a match one for one of what happened. And
Right.
the NTSB report is out, obviously, on the older crash. So I'm going to talk about the stuff that no one's really telling you or has told you about the Neil M family plane crash. But I'm also going to do a deep dive in that video on the other PC-12 plane crash and how they all tie together. And that one is going to be, I think, a very fascinating one, but it's also a very heartbreaking one, because I'll go ahead and tell you that the other PC-12 plane crash, there was, I think, three or four kids? I think three kids were on board. And if you're not familiar with the Neil M family plane crash, basically it was an in-flight breakup of the aircraft, just like in this other one that I'm going to talk about in that video. And when it happened, one of the kids, got sucked out of the aircraft. And I think it took them like a day and a half to find them. So, that's how serious this stuff is. And that's how serious you have to treat, your license when you're signed off and somebody says, okay, you're now safe to fly and you're now qualified to fly, and you're going to put passengers on an aircraft. Like, lives are at stake, and people need to understand that. So,
aviation in general, and this is the term that I like to use, it's a vocation. It's not necessarily a hobby. A hobby is something like, if I'm going to go fly a drone, okay, that's fine. But, aviation as a pilot, as an aviator, is a vocation. And so you have to treat it as such, and that requires a certain degree of professionalism. And even though you're not necessarily getting paid, but you have to know your aircraft, you have to know your systems, you have to be attentive to the weather, and be diligent and have routines and stick to those routines. And, never assume that you've got it all figured out, because you just don't. And there's always going to be something that has to be taken into consideration. And I think, regrettably, it's often overlooked. But so,
yep. Okay. Well, I'm going to let everybody run. It is the weekend. Thanks, Mike Rowan Fly, for that last super chat, as well as all the other super chats that I wasn't able to get to. I need to do a better job about that. You guys are very supportive, and I greatly appreciate it.
I posted several of them up there, and
okay.
I was trying to, you were doing your thing. I'm in the background, sort of backing you up. So I did try to make sure that we called them out. And so I think awesome. I think we can let you go and get on with your day. And
y'all have a good weekend. Again, no video tomorrow, but I'm trying to get caught up. I got to go back down to I got to do my CQ, my quarterly, or not quarterly.
Okay.
I got to do my anyways, I'm on reserve this month, and I keep getting called in. And then on top of that, I've got training that I have to do on Monday and Tuesday. So it's been a struggle, but I'm going to get back on track.
It's like I'm working like 24 shifts this month. So it's brutal. Everybody's on vacation except me. So it's all good. And I've got another accident that I'll forward over to you that I did in it's actually there's some good lessons learned, and it's also covers sort of flying over the water and some of the safety things that we should be looking at with that as well. So
okay.
But
awesome.
That coming from a Coast Guard guy,
All right. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.
See ya.